Colonel Daniel Davis, who's, I think, up until now, when we had this withdrawal, was largely an unsung hero when it comes to speaking out. He's someone who is mostly forgotten. I mean, if we would talk about people, I don't think he would come up quite as much. And so he's had an opportunity to get his name back out there and share his experience, which was to recognize that the truth on the ground was not matching what people were saying in the press. And he challenged the entire military strategy and said that there's no way it could work. So he's someone who believed in the Afghanistan war, but said what you're doing is it's guaranteed to fail. And he testified. He released this report that was published by Michael Hastings at the Rolling Stones website. And this is an individual who, along with Michael Hastings, they were doing this during President Barack Obama's administration, which, as I already said, that war was dubbed the Good War. So anybody who spoke ill of Afghanistan and the operations in Afghanistan was usually pushed aside and ignored.
Yeah. The stories of Ho and Davis are so important because these are two military figures essentially on each side of the surge. Ho predicting that wouldn't work, and then Davis essentially confirming what Ho predicted essentially turned out to be the truth. These guys have done tons of great interviews on their story. I'm sure, I don't know if you've interviewed Danny Davis. I know Scott Horton has, and has gone through his whole story on there if you want to check that out. But one of the great things that he actually went around to all the different areas of Afghanistan while he was a colonel and witnessed that it wasn't working, and then was just did what he was supposed to do and told people about it. And it's just so uncommon in our military that you have people willing to speak out. And Danny Davis is maybe one of the most important voices we have, just because he is on the right and sounds like a tough guy, right? Whenever he speaks, he just kind of has that military command in his voice, and that carries that authority. And when you're speaking that way to the people who even would dismiss, let's say, a Matthew Ho or a Danny Shershon, who were both served in Afghanistan, and yet there are people in America on the right who's never travel outside the country who will tell you that those silly commies don't know what they're talking about. That you can't quite dismiss Danny Davis that way, and that's something really important that he brings to the table. And he's continued to speak out against the wars the whole time, and is really has advocated for the U.S. to leave Afghanistan. Was so important. Anything else on Davis or Hastings?
Well, let me just, because we all know Michael Hastings died tragically, and there's one thing that I pulled from a part of his book that's not necessarily directly connected to what he did around Stanley McChrystal, but just in general was an assessment of the Afghanistan war and also a lot of the global war on terrorism, where he wrote, I'm reading, Bin Laden's death revealed the biggest lie of the war, the safe haven myth. Afghanistan's version of WMDs, the concept of waging an extremely expensive and bloody counterinsurgency campaign to prevent safe havens never truly made sense. Terrorists didn't need countries. And I think that's a really important thing for us to all keep in our minds going forward, now that the U.S. no longer has its military bases in Afghanistan, because we're going to hear all this conversation for the next 6 months to a year, especially in order to drag down the choices that the Biden administration made, because the Pentagon really didn't want this withdrawal. And what we're going to hear from the biggest boosters like David Petraeus let me add in another name, Leon Panetta, has been pretty god-awful when it comes to his suggestions that it's a guarantee that Afghanistan is going to become a safe haven for ISIS-K. You have all these people making these wild pronouncements or claims about what will definitely happen, again, without any evidence that that's what the Taliban would want to happen to Afghanistan, without any discussion of why it would be in their interest to allow these extremist groups to destabilize and make it difficult for them to control their country. So I think it's something to keep in mind that this diagnosis that Hastings had earlier on in the war, like 10 years ago at this point, nearly 10 years ago, was really spot on. This idea that we shouldn't be invading countries simply because they're safe havens for terrorists. Terrorists are always going to find places that they can launch their attacks.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's important to bring up. Recently, Paul Wolfowitz had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal and Robert Kagan in the Washington Post, and both articles kind of concluded with, boy, imagine if there's another 9/11 now that we left Afghanistan. When, of course, if you look at even the 9/11 plot itself, much of it was plotted in Karachi, Pakistan, which, of course, is a country with heavy ties to the U.S. And Osama bin Laden had hung out in Pakistan for like a decade. Which, kind of amazing how the U.S. ally didn't find our most wanted in their country. It was also planned in Hamburg, Germany, in Malaysia, in San Diego. They got their flight training in the U.S. Really, other than Osama bin Laden hanging out in a cave in Afghanistan, when he wasn't, maybe even the most important actor was Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who's still in Guantanamo Bay. I think they're actually going to try to move his trial forward in this coming week. 20 years after the whole 9/11 thing, but it is just important to remember that this war, it wasn't about Osama bin Laden, and if it was, they probably would have gotten him in Afghanistan before he made it to Pakistan, but they definitely would have found him before 2011, and even then, if it was about Osama bin Laden, it would have ended in 2011, and it didn't, so that's pretty much all the proof you need right there.